Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk at RSA. Terry Sweeney here, contributing editor with Dark Reading, and I'm happy to welcome back to News Desk John Shier, Field CTO Commercial of Sophos. John, great to see you again.
Thanks, it's great to see you again. It's amazing, we keep running into each other at InfoSec conferences.
It seems to be the case. We are here to talk about the state of ransomware. Sophos has just completed its 5th annual State of Ransomware report. Can you give us an overview or a preview of the findings and maybe some surprises out of the data this year?
Yeah, maybe I can give you a good news sandwich. So for the first time in a little while, we actually saw a slight dip in ransomware, and that's across all revenue segments. So that's a bit of good news. But what we're also seeing is that for the second year in a row, exploiting vulnerabilities and compromised credentials are the leading root causes for how attackers are getting in. We're seeing about a third of the attackers now are stealing data. So, you know, in addition to that ransomware that we've been so used to and the double extortion, right? So we're kind of putting numbers around that as well. But there's some other numbers that are a bit surprising. The amount of attackers that are trying to compromise backups. So over 90% are trying to compromise backups. And the median ransomware payment has gone up by 5x this year. So that was a bit shocking in terms of what we're seeing out there. We also tried something new this year. We asked about ransom demand. So not only the payment, but for the first time we said, what was the demand that the attackers asked for? And in about 63% of those cases, we saw a demand of $1 million or more. And finally, the good news at the end is that in about 97% of attacks globally, we found out that the users reported, the respondents said that they were able to contact law enforcement or regulatory agencies. So that's really good, because what that does is it helps us get a sense of the scale and the scope of the problem, and then out of that we can probably, hopefully, do something about it.
Well, those are that really kind of sets the scene, doesn't it? It sounds like phishers and attackers are really taking advantage of all the advances in automation. Dare we say it, AI as well. This has to be fueling a lot of the volumes that you're seeing, right?
Specifically on the social side, yes, we are seeing some more threats that are using AI. We're seeing these in what we call the crypto ROM scams, or the pig butchering scams, where there's a chat bot, or there are some components that can use AI to scale not only from the quantity standpoint, but also scale across languages, right? If you're not an expert in the various languages that you want to target, then AI can be good for that. So we are seeing that specifically in the social side. Thankfully, we're not seeing it a lot in the malware side.
John, that $1 million ransomware ask is an eye-opener. What can you tell us about how victims are being impacted?
Yeah, so in addition to the median ransom payment going up so high, we're also seeing that the recovery costs are also increasing. And so with recovery costs increasing now, when we look at the recovery costs themselves, this is apart from the ransomware payment numbers. And those are also increasing, basically doubling over last year. So if you put those together, the ransomware payment for those that do choose to pay, and it's around half, and the recovery costs themselves that are doubling, you're getting a pretty good picture as to how much ransomware can really cost an organization. And then above and beyond that, we've got recovery times as well. So when an organization gets hit by ransomware, if their files are, if their systems are getting encrypted, if data is getting stolen, and if they don't have backups, we're finding that the recovery times are increasing, and companies are just having a harder time. So overall, all of these things just costing a lot more money for companies that are being hit by ransomware today.
Sure, it also sheds some light on that focus on backups that ransomware attackers have undertaken, apparently.
Absolutely. So with the attackers going after the backups, we're seeing, at least from the respondents' view, that about half of the time they are actually being successful in accessing those backups and then compromising them in some way, whether it's simply just stealing them or even encrypting them as well. But that leads to worse consequences as well. So for the organizations that did have their backups compromised, we're seeing that the recovery costs go up by 8 times. The payments are doubled, and they're also twice as likely to pay than if they didn't have than if they did have their backups available to them. So all in all, just having your backups compromised, because if you think about it, there are basically 2 ways to recover from a ransomware attack. You either have good backups that you can resort to, or you have to somehow decrypt the data and by generally paying the ransom. So if it's not one of those two options, then you're kind of like left scrambling.
John, you also mentioned that the rate of ransomware overall is slightly declining. Tell us more about that.
So the decline, it's a bit hard to pin down why some of these numbers move the way that they do. Now, I think the rise is probably pretty self-explanatory, right? There's a lot of money to be made. And unfortunately, there's a lot of potential victims out there. But these declines, as we see year on year, it's actually been pretty steady. So we've seen a bit of a plateau in the last few years, and we see this both in our survey responses as well as in our incident response data. So I think that part of it could be just sampling, right? You just happen to sample this set of organizations where the rate was a little bit lower, but I think this is a pretty large random sample, so I don't think that that's the case. What we are seeing is there is more adoption of better technologies out there. People are consuming things like their MDR services, they're deploying better technologies, and so they're able to detect sooner. But if you think about the stat, so in this case it was 59%. The other 41% that wasn't classified as ransomware, the other 41%, almost half of the threats that saw are sometimes precursors to ransomware. They're info stealers. They're the ones that are going to go and get credentials that are then going to be used in that root cause that I talked about, right? Which is the number 2 root cause in this case of breaching an organization. So these precursors are a problem as well. And so we need to really understand how all this fits together as an ecosystem as a whole and fight on every side as opposed to just focusing on ransomware.
John, talk a bit about trends that you see with the ways that victims are being breached, but also insights on how companies can better defend themselves.
Right, so we talked about the root causes being exploited vulnerabilities and compromised credentials being number 1 and 2. So exploiting vulnerabilities, right? We're seeing a lot of talk these days, specifically around external services, VPNs, all sorts of different network devices that are being compromised. This is something that we need to get our hands around and really make sure that any external presence is necessary and is absolutely rock solid, right? You need to make sure that you're patching these devices and that things like multi-factor authentication are turned on for any kind of authentication services that are on those devices. As with compromised credentials as well, right? So with compromised credentials, multi-factor will stop, if not at least slow down most attackers. And with respect to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th elements on the list, right? We're seeing things like malicious emails, phishing, and then brute forcing. And if you see a theme there, which is they're probably after credentials, right? The malicious emails, sometimes they exploit the device, but a lot of times they're also looking to download an info stealer, which will get credentials off the box. And as far as phishing goes, that's usually for credential theft, and same with brute force. So a lot of this stuff is just really addressing the top 2 points, which is the really obvious ones and the ones that are used most often. But then we have to look again a little deeper, peel back a couple layers and go, what are the secondary and tertiary causes? And let's address those as well. Because sometimes when you address the first 2, you start to knock off the other ones as well.
John, great job synthesizing the data from your report. It feels like we may have barely scratched the surface, but is there maybe a data point that you'd like to send people away with?
Yeah, so security is about managing risk, right? And to manage that risk, you need to understand what you have out there, you need to understand the state of those things, and you need to understand your risk posture. And I think where a lot of companies, especially in the SMB side where resources are limited, that's part of where they fail. They don't understand the risk that their environment is posing on them and the opportunities that it presents to attackers. So I think that we're at a point now, and we've been at a point for a couple of years, but there's no shame in asking for help, right? There's a lot of companies that just don't have the resources in-house. So if you need the help, if you can really critically assess your capabilities and you say, okay, we need help in assessing our risk posture, or we need help in monitoring and detecting in response, go get that help. We've got one of the most comprehensive MDR offerings out there, and thanks to our partnership with Tenable, we're able to provide these managed risk services as well. So if you need help, come ask us. We'll be all too happy to give you a hand and make sure that you can put your best foot forward.
Well, your reports are always a great barometer reading of which way the security winds are blowing, to really torture the metaphor there. But thank you. It's great to have data that backs up what are largely impressions across the industry. So thanks for filling us in on where ransomware is in 2024.
Absolutely, Terry. Thank you for letting us share that research with you, and it was great seeing you again.
Great. Thanks again for doing this. We've been talking with John Shier, Field CTO Commercial with Sophos. This has been Terry Sweeney with Dark Reading. Thanks for joining us for this News Desk segment. We'll see you next time.